Well, this will teach you to get here early. This is amazing. This is great. I think we might have set a record. We had 70 people for the Tenino Stonecutter a couple months ago, and I think we might have beaten that. We'll see. I've reached the age where I realize that I'm a part of history now. I guess we all are, really, for that matter. The things from your childhood that you took for granted, you know, technology of the era was modern at the time, you know. One example I think of are TV antennas. Don't see those anymore, but it used to be every house had them. And then once that era passed, you get maybe a mythology buildup about some of those old technologies. I came across a story of 2 TV antennas that got married. The wedding ceremony was terrible, but the reception was great. Okay, had to throw that in. Okay. How many people are here for the first time at one of these talks? Oh, good. This is a pretty good turnout. Oh, even the TV guy. All right, good. Well, for your first timers, we have a great lineup of speakers for the monthly history talks. We have the twice-a-month schedule of our very popular house tours, guided house tours. Bob Krim has been working with the Schmidt family for 60 years now, and he has all these stories about the family and the house, and so we do those twice a month, and we have a schedule on that front table as you came in. Those are at 11 in the morning on a Tuesday, twice a month, and so you'll want to sign up ahead of time because we limit it to 15 people. This size of a group would never be able to make one of those tours together. But we would love to have you get in on the rotation. And also in the summertime, we have Riverwalk tours that are guided down at the Falls Park Trail and talk about Tumwater history that way. So that's always fun too. And that's July, August, September that we do those. Well, we welcome you to the historic Schmidt House, built in 1904, or at least that section of it was. And the more modern section that we're in today was added in 1910. So it's the modern, only 115-year-old part of the building that we're in right now. The house was built by and for Leopold and Johanna Schmidt, and today is owned by the Olympia Tumwater Foundation, who's hosting these talks in conjunction with the city of Tumwater. Restroom is located in the entry behind the front desk. A lot of you have already experienced how you have to crouch down and be under the stairway there. We try to create a historic ambiance here today, so please take out those modern cell phones and smartphones and dumb phones and silence the ringtones. And we are video recording the history talk today, as we do each month, for a later cable cast on Tumwater TV channel 26. So in about a month from now, you'll be able to see this all over again on the TCTV. Today's speaker, Karen Johnson, is well known in local history circles. Not just here in Thurston County either. She's worked for the Lewis County Museum, the Bigelow House here in Olympia, the Cowlitz County and the Castle Rock Exhibition Hall, and now has been hired on here as the Archives Curator at the Schmidt House. So Karen now works with us. She's an author and speaker and is on the board of the Tumwater Historical Association also. And that's where I got to first meet her. There we go. Pioneers didn't have that tone. But anyway, when Karen was, I got to meet her when she arranged our reenactment of a stagecoach run from Olympia down to Longview. And then the next year we did it the other direction. Wow. And so that was a fun event, and that's Karen was the instigator and organizer of that event along with the rest of the THA. But Karen is going to be talking about our branch of the Oregon Trail, which is called the Cowlitz Trail. And Mrs. Simmons, Michael D. Simmons' wife, Elizabeth, said of the whole Oregon Trail, that part was the most difficult part of the whole trip out west, was that little section from Calais Landing, or Toledo, to here. And so I'm going to turn it over to Karen Johnson.
Thank you, Don Pardo. And we were just discussing. Yeah, I know who you are. But what TV show was Don Pardo with? He did the announcing for what? Jeopardy or?
Yeah.
Okay, sounds good.
Saturday Night Live.
Okay, so we're going to be talking about the Cowlitz Trail that started on the Columbia River and ran north to Puget Sound. And I'm calling this Through the Bowels of the Land, and I'm not going to tell you why I called it that until we get to the very end. But I'm glad you all came today. This is quite the turnout. I'm pleased. Have any of you ever been on the Oregon Trail? Any parts of it? Mm-hmm. Parts of it? Okay. And you've obviously read quite a bit about it. Where did the Oregon Trail start?
St. Joe.
St. Louis? St. Joe, somebody said? Any other ideas? Missouri?
Independence.
Independence, Missouri, yeah. Where did it end?
All the way along.
Yes, all the way along, she said. Yeah, that's about right. If we like to picture the Oregon Trail as a piece of rope that's frayed at each end. So if you were in St. Joseph or Independence or Council Bluffs, or maybe your part of the Oregon Trail started in Maine or South Carolina or Kentucky. But eventually, by the time you got to the Independence area, Council Bluffs area, you were on, let's say, the main body of the Oregon Trail. But as you headed west, that rope started fraying again. And you might have taken a cutoff to Salt Lake City. You might have taken a cutoff to California. You might have kept on going to the Oregon Territory and ended up in the Portland area, Portland and the Dalles, that area along the Willamette and Columbia. One day I was giving a talk to a bunch of high schoolers who had been homeschooled, and their mothers had just finished telling me that the kids had completed their study about Western U.S. history. So I thought, well, I'll quiz the kids, see how much they know. So I was telling them about the split of the trail and how it came out to California. I said, you know when the California gold rush was? Blank faces, completely blank. Well, the California gold rush was right in the middle of the 1800s, still blank. 18, come on, the California gold rush of 18, no, still blank. So I thought, what kind of a clue can I give these kids to let them get the right answer? So I finally got really smart and I said, the year of the California gold rush is the same as the name of a professional sports team. Well, the light bulbs went on then. And one kid raised his hand and he said, I know, the 76ers. I thought I was being so smart. Well, let's get on with this then. So here's a loose map of the Oregon Trail, and you can see some of the starting points over on the right-hand side, St. Joseph and Independence and whatnot. Here's another question for you, a little audience participation again. Why did people come west over the Oregon Trail? Any ideas? Got to speak loud so I can hear you. Land, yeah, free land. Well, free in a sense. They didn't have to pay for the land. As long as they proved up on it by building a house, living there for a number of years, and doing something productive with the land, which usually meant clearing it and putting it into crops. They had the land for free. Later on, they could actually shorten the time they had to live there by paying money for the land too, but it was still very low cost. So free or otherwise land. What other reasons did people come west? Gold, if you're headed to California. Any other ideas? Adventure, that's a good one, yeah. Independence, okay.
New beginning.
New beginning, that all sounds good. Well, let's look at some of these. Some people just wanted more elbow room. Believe it or not, they were feeling crowded back east. We'd already talked about free land or better land. Some land back east might already have been farmed out, and they were looking for more productive land. They wanted to beat the rush. They knew there were a lot of people coming west, and they wanted to get there first and have their pick of land. Promotional campaigns. The government and cities, well, can't really call them cities, towns out here were trying to promote the Northwest and the West Coast so that more people would come and actually settle this country. How about racial freedom? Back east, down south, African Americans were having a hard time either owning their own land or starting a business, all the things that go along with racism and segregation, that sort of thing applied even back in those years. And they wanted to help secure the Northwest and the West Coast for the U.S. because there are so many countries vying for ownership, if you will, of this part of the country. So now after having spent usually a pretty arduous journey, 6 months or so, on the Oregon Trail, people finally arrive in Oregon, the blessed Oregon country, and they come to Portland or Oregon City, that area. They've reached it, they've made it. Why in the world, after 6 months of hardship, would they then decide to come farther north to Puget Sound? Same reasons, really the same reasons. Some of the, especially the Willamette Valley that we think of being so rich now, and of course most of it's built up, was already crowded. All the good land claims are already taken up. So they were looking for more elbow room. They were still looking for free land. They wanted to beat the rush to Puget Sound. and racial freedom, we'll talk about that in a minute, and also to help secure the Northwest for the U.S. The Hudson's Bay Company, English firm, was very interested in retaining for itself all the land north of the Columbia River, and the U.S. wanted that land for itself. So pioneers were encouraged, American pioneers were encouraged to settle north of the Columbia River, but there were a lot of problems associated with that. But let's talk first about, when we talk about some of those reasons why people came north of the Portland area, let's first talk about racial freedom. We all know, of course, about George Bush, pioneer of this area in 1845. And some of you might have heard of George Washington, who was also an African American. He came out a few years later than Bush, and he settled the Centralia area. When these two men got out here with their respective parties that they came out with, they found, they came out here in some ways for racial freedom because they were prohibited from owning things back east. So they decided, we'll come out to Oregon Territory and we'll be free. Not so. Oregon Territory had a lot of laws called exclusion laws, where blacks or people of any color really were not encouraged, and in some cases were not allowed to own land, to even live there. For a while, Oregon had what they called a lash law. And if you were a black living in Oregon and you didn't move out, you had like about 6 months time frame to move out. If you decided to stay past that 6-month grace period, you were subject to lashing, physical whipping, and up to 30 or 40 lashes to encourage you to hit the road. And there were other laws that excluded blacks from Oregon Territory. So when George Bush and George Washington got here, they quickly found that out, and they decided to move north of the Columbia River. Now, what we call Washington today was still part of Oregon Territory, so those laws still applied up here, but the sheriff and other law enforcement officials from the Portland area didn't cross the river. So technically, even living up here in what would become Washington, the blacks were still compelled to follow those segregation laws and exclusion laws, but nobody ever came up here to enforce them, so they felt they were fairly safe living up here. And by the way, Oregon was the only state that was ever admitted to the U.S. with an exclusion law in its constitution. And that wording to exclude blacks, African Americans, from living in the state wasn't removed until 1927, when the state finally got their act together and formally removed that wording from the books. I find that amazing. And there was an early settler named John Minto who wrote about Bush. He told me he should watch when we got to Oregon what usage was awarded to people of color, and if he could not have a free man's rights, he would seek the protection of the Mexican government in California or New Mexico. Well, that was Bush's original plan, but then, of course, he managed to come up here. And both Bush and Washington were so highly thought of by their fellow settlers and their neighbors that the neighbors petitioned U.S. Congress back in Washington City, as it was known at the time, or Washington, D.C., they wrote a petition, signed a petition by dozens of people to allow both Bush and Washington to own land and to live here without fear. And the Congress passed both of those requests. Can you imagine that happening today, where neighbors would get together and formally petition Congress to protect somebody, to recognize somebody's worth? And I hope you realize, too, that George Bush did not have a middle name. You see it in so many places where everyone refers to George Bush as George Washington Bush or George W. Bush. I hope someday that we can have Jewel Dunn, who's a local genealogist, come and give a talk on her research into proving that Bush did not have a middle name. But if he did, it wasn't Washington. But you know, once something is in ink and the ink is dry, that's the way it is. And also, this is not a true portrait of George Bush. Nobody knows what he looked like. We've never found a photo of him or an attributed portrait, so this was an artist's concept. So there are some things about Bush that are out there in the research world, but they're made up. So that's something we always have to look out for. So that covers some of the racial reasons that people came up into Washington Territory. Esther Short and her husband and family came out to the Vancouver area really to help secure land for Americans. She and her husband settled a claim right next to the British Hudson's Bay Fort at Fort Vancouver, and they reached here in 1845, and they were not well thought of by the Hudson's Bay Company Fort chief factors. People like Peter Skeen Ogden and John McLaughlin, who ran that fort, didn't want her living there. But she was pretty feisty, Esther was. And at one point, Amos, her husband, was arrested and jailed by Hudson's Bay. And whilst he was in jail, some HBC employees were sent out to kick Esther off her claim. Well, she had a problem with that, so she actually slapped one of the HBC employees down to the ground. And the employee scurried back to the fort and told Peter Skeen Ogden that, this is a feisty lady. And Peter Skeen Ogden said, well, we'd better give it up. We can never hope to win against such a brave woman as that. So Esther did continue living there even after her husband passed away, and there's now a park in Vancouver that's named for her, the Esther Short Park. We have people like Edward J. Allen. Some of you may have heard of him. There's been a couple books written about him. He was a pioneer of 1852. He actually came west over the Oregon Trail for his health, believe it or not. We don't really know what he had, consumption or something, but he was coughing up blood all the time. He lived in Pittsburgh, which even back in the 1850s was a darn smoky city, all kinds of coal mining and coal burning factories. So he came out west for his health. When he got here, he was pretty much cured of his cough. He never coughed up blood again. He decided to come north over the Cowlitz Trail for land and to beat the rush. He had been talking to Governor John Pollard Gaines, who was governor of Oregon Territory at that time. And of Gaines, he said, this is what Eddie wrote, his view of the great advantages possessed by northern Oregon, which was everything north of the Columbia, and especially of the high destiny of Puget Sound, confirmed the impression I had previous to leaving home and deepened the resolve I had formed to go on. A great many of the immigrants, too, by this time had arrived, the majority of whom, together with a large number of the old settlers from the Willamette Valley, were going to Puget Sound in the spring. Hitherto, public attention had been but little drawn to that part of the country, for the trains of the previous year had, overjoyed at the transition from dry plains and sterile hills they had crossed, settled in the first valley they had come to, till the best of the lands in the lower country, especially the Columbia and Willamette valleys, were taken up. At least 20,000 had started for Oregon alone this year. The remainder would have to go to the mines or else northward to Puget Sound, and I was anxious to be ahead of them. So that's why Eddie came north. So how did people actually get here? If they had arrived in Oregon Territory, what were the ways that he could take to get up to Puget Sound? The Cowlitz Trail was the overland trail, as we called it, although part of it was by water, that left the Portland area and came more or less due north to Puget Sound. There was also the ocean route. Dan Bigelow, who arrived in Portland and had come on foot over the Oregon Trail with a wagon train, decided when he got to Portland that he would take passage on a ship. So he got on board the schooner Exact in Portland and went down the Columbia, up and around on the water route, and eventually ended up in Olympia. So he came the long way away. I assume he was just tired of walking. And then the other route, the Natchez Pass route, was one that was developed by Edward J. Allen in 1853. So from the fall of 1853 onward, people could, if they wanted to go directly to Puget Sound, take a cutoff from the Walla Walla area and go through the mountains and then be right there at Seattle or Olympia or Steilacoom. But today we're going to focus on just the Cowlitz Trail, which was named for the Cowlitz Indians. Started in the Portland, Fort Vancouver area, and the first part of the trail was by water, unless you were driving stock or had wagons to haul. So you would have gotten on board a bateau, which was kind of a large flat-bottomed boat, or an Indian canoe, and gone downriver on the Willamette or the Columbia until you reached Monticello, which was an old town, and it is pronounced Monticello, even though it's Monticello back east. So by the time you reached Monticello, then you would be going up against the current in the Cowlitz River until you got to Calais Landing, which is close to today's Toledo. And then from there you had to get off the river because the river curved and went up towards the mountains. So then you had to go overland and come due north to Olympia or Steilacoom or wherever you're headed. but I'm going to show you some landmarks along the way. So they would have started off on the Columbia River by going downstream with the current. That was the easier part. And one of the first landmarks they would have come by was the Hudson's Bay Fort Vancouver. And this was run by Peter Skeen Ogden and John McLaughlin and other chief factors during the time. The U.S. military fort, which is on the left of this photo and kind of in the background, came a little bit later, but HBC had been there since the 1820s or so a long-term establishment there. And people often talk about coming through the wilderness, into the wilderness when they got here. But the HBC had been here for so long that they had some lovely buildings. The officers and high muckety-mucks there at HBC were eating off of spode china, so they didn't have life too bad. I've got to digress for a moment here and tell you a story about John McLaughlin, who was chief factor here for several years. He eventually, when he retired from Hudson's Bay, built a house in Oregon City and lived there. And his house still exists, although it had been moved to a different location. It used to be down near the river, and now it's up on the banks above the river. Has anybody ever visited the McLaughlin house? Okay. Several years ago, I was lucky enough to go down there with Roger Easton. Many of you will remember Roger. And we took a tour of the McLaughlin house. The docent was telling us about the history of the house, and she said that after the McLaughlins died, the house was turned into a hotel because it was a good-sized house. Not huge, but good-sized. And then after a few years, it degraded and became a boarding house. And then after several years, it degraded even more and became a house of ill repute. Yes, of course. We knew she was going to say a house of ill repute. But instead, she paused and she said a house of negotiable affection. So, and just to show you how long Hudson's Bay had been in the area, this is the Northwest oldest apple tree. It was planted from seed that was brought over by a ship captain visiting Fort Vancouver, and he planted those seeds about 1826. Trees offer a good landmark. We're going to see a couple other trees in this presentation, and tomorrow, the old chestnut trees that are out at Mills and Mills Funeral Home are being recognized. So if you have time to go to that ceremony tomorrow at noon at Mills and Mills, do that. I think that'll be a fun way to recognize those trees and get a little bit of history too. Another tree, black walnut tree, still exists, although it's not in very good health, and it's at the site of Harry Darby Huntington's home, who settled in the Monticello, now Longview area. His home site has now been kind of swallowed up by industrial portions of Longview, but the tree is still there. So as the settlers would travel along, they'd still be on the river. They'd come up the Cowlitz River, again by Indian canoe or bateau, and because they're coming up against the current, they often had Native Americans who would provide the power to get them up, either by rowing or by poling with long poles, where they could stick the pole in the riverbank and then pull it up. Sometimes one Indian would even go ahead and tie a rope to a tree, and then they'd physically pull the boats up. So they had several different methods of working up against the strong current of the Cowlitz River. This is a little creek called Olaqua Creek, which is north of Castle Rock and comes into the Cowlitz River. Phoebe Goodell Judson, who wrote the book A Pioneer's Search for an Ideal Home, a great book to read if you haven't seen that one yet. She came out in 1853, and she wrote about coming up the river. The next morning, we began the ascent of the Cowlitz River in an Indian canoe, propelled by Indian muscle, making about the same speed against a strong current as did our oxen when pulling up a steep mountain. There were many portages where jams of logs obstructed the river. Frequently, the water was so shallow that the Indians pushed the canoe along more rapidly than they paddled through the deep water. For a time, the novelty of the scene was quite interesting, but as there was a lack of variation, it soon became monotonous, only varied by the mild excitement of the occasional salmon leaping from the water. By the time the pioneers, either walking on a trail, especially if they had cattle drive, a trail that came up the east side of the Cowlitz River, or on the Cowlitz River itself, they would eventually reach the mouth of the Toutle River, which would come in from the mountains from the right over there where the red dot is, that's the confluence of the Cowlitz and Toutle rivers. And there lived a man by the name of James Gardner. He was known as Hardbread. He ran a hotel of sorts. He ran a restaurant of sorts. And he was named Hardbread because guess what he served at every meal? And by all accounts, it was hard bread. There are many pioneers who mention the hard bread at this place. When Edward J. Allen came up in 1852, he and his partner, who were driving some cattle, stopped at Hardbread's place, and they, for the first time in about a week or so, they had a chance to wash up and have a meal cooked by someone else. So Eddie wrote, "It was a luxury to have a piece of soap and a basin to wash in. Our meal was somewhat delayed, as we discovered when our salmon and potatoes were served to us in the basin we had been using. It seems there was a scarcity of utensils in the establishment, and the basin had to serve many purposes. It might have been well to have cleansed it after each diverse use, but the old man was a little careless in such matters." Anna Maria Cable Cutting, who came up in 1852 and was related by marriage to George Roberts, who was also an HBC company employee, wrote of her journey, "The next morning we started early for what we called the Forks of the Cowlitz, where we had to stay all night. Oh, horrors! There was but one room and no beds, though there were several men travelers, so we had to spread our blankets like the rest. The next morning we started again early, of course, for Calais Landing, where we arrived about 2 or 3 in the afternoon and walked to Cowlitz Prairie to the house of Mr. Plamondon, where we stayed all night. Now, shortly after they got here, well, a year or two, Anna lost her husband to what she called Oregon fever. I don't know exactly what that was, but that's the term she used for it. Shortly thereafter, she married Hardbread. And they didn't spend too much more time in the Lewis Cowlitz County area. They moved to Olympia, and in 1858, Hardbread committed suicide. His suicide note was published in the paper of the time, and he said, "Please don't blame my wife, even though she was obstinate and purposely insulting." So when Hardbread's estate was being settled, Anna would have had reason to discuss things with a man by the name of Richard Lane, another former Hudson's Bay Company employee who had since left HBC and was now Thurston County auditor and court clerk, and also became an attorney. So they got married. And not too much later, Richard Lane started divorce proceedings against Anna, and he divorced her. Then he took to drink. He spent some time in what would become Western State Hospital, drying out, and then he committed suicide. So Anna either had dubious taste in men, or, well, you've heard the term Black Widow. Well, Anna did mention coming to the house of Mr. Plamondon, who was Simon Plamondon, another Hudson's Bay person who was here early on. He was in the 1820s and 1830s as a very young man. And this is a cabin that exists north of Castle Rock. As far as I know, it's still there. I've seen it, I've been in it. It's a very little cabin, but it was built by Simon Plamondon and his son circa 1860 or so. And in the left-hand side, I hope you can see, there's some hash marks in the logs. Yeah. So we assume that when the Plamondons were building that cabin, they probably dry fit the logs, and then put hash marks on them so that it could identify the order in which the logs went together when they put it back and actually built it for real. So those hash marks still exist, and this is from 1860, so this is some cool stuff here. The cabin, though, is on private land, so it's not accessible. This photo shows the Cowlitz River near Cowlitz Landing. Cowlitz Landing has gone through a lot of different names, I guess. People get mixed up on it because there were so many things happening there just within a few miles of each other. There was Cowlitz Landing, which was an American town. There was Cowlitz Landing, which was the actual landing place on the river where Hudson's Bay bateaus would come up and offload to come to a farm called Cowlitz Farms, which was owned by the Puget Sound Agricultural Company, which was an offshoot of Hudson's Bay. So there's a lot of different names going on there, but all had to do with Cowlitz, but they're all separate entities. But it marked the point at where settlers coming north, if they were on the river, they had to leave the river, and from here on out to come up to Puget Sound, they had to walk or ride. Paul Kane was an artist in the 1840s. He came out here, and in 1847, he visited this area and drew sketches and did paintings along the way. A great legacy he's left us of how things looked back then. He happened to sketch this Cowlitz tribal woman named, I'm guessing at the pronunciation here, Kawacham, a woman of the Cowlitz tribe with her child under the process of having its head flattened. It was with some difficulty that I persuaded her to sit for me, as she seemed apprehensive that it would be injurious to her. And I think a lot of Native Americans also felt that way about photographic images. They thought that somehow the photography would do something to them, steal their soul. They were very leery of that part of our culture, which was something that we accept readily. And if you left the river, you eventually had to head through some mighty big trees. Has anybody been down to Lewis and Clark State Park by Toledo? Yeah. If you haven't been there, you should go just to get an idea of the kind of country that the settlers had to travel through. And if you do go, keep in mind that as close as those trees are together and as big as they are, it's much, much less than it used to be, because the Columbus Day storm of 1962, some of us remember that, blew down probably about a third of the timber in Lewis and Clark State Park, and it's since been, some of it's been cleaned up. Some of the downed logs are still there as nurse logs. But if you can imagine that forest being, a third thicker than it is, it's amazing that people could even get through there with wagons. The next landmark travelers on the Cowlitz Trail would have reached would have been the cabin and farm of John R. Jackson and his wife Matilda. John Jackson came out here from back east in 1845, 1844, and probably was the first American to settle any place, even predating Michael T. Simmons here in 1845. John was already there. They kind of came out together, but it was probably the first, as iffy as firsts can be around here. But he and his wife were well known to be very hospitable. This cabin still exists just north of Lewis and Clark State Park, and it was refurbished in the late 1920s. And there's probably one floorboard that's still original, so the bulk of it is not original, but the shape, the look of it are very authentic. So the people that refurbished it and rebuilt it were very faithful to the original.
Is that Jackson Highway?
John Jackson Highway, yeah. To where Highway 12 and Jackson Highway intersect, this is just about half a mile south of that intersection. The Jacksons also, in 1853, when Washington Territory had just been split off and had formally become a territory on its own, they decided to sew a flag. So they ordered flag material from San Francisco. It was shipped up here, and Jackson and Matilda and their neighbors got together and sewed this flag, which is still in the collection of the State Historical Society in Tacoma. And I don't remember how big it is, probably, well, I would think about 8 feet wide or so. It's pretty big. And obviously has some condition issues, but it still exists. That's quite neat. So after leaving Jackson's, you still would have been traveling through trees for a long time, and then would eventually gotten into the swamps around Chehalis and Centralia. Erastus Light, who came out in 1853, wrote, "The first day's ride was through Saunders Bottom, where for the greater part of 7 miles we had to keep our feet drawn up alongside the ponies to keep them out of the mud and water." Phoebe Goodell Judson, who we already heard from, wrote about that same area. She said, "Passing over much unoccupied country, where only now and then a hardy frontiersman was clearing up a ranch, we reached Saunders Prairie, as it was called, but only a low, open country where for years, during the winter season, travelers were obliged to swim their horses through the swales." And of course, there is the probably apocryphal story about a rider one time who was going through the swamplands around Saunders Bottom, which is now Chehalis, and he was riding his own horse, and he had another pack horse with him, and he saw a man's hat floating on the water ahead of him. The hat was moving a little bit with the current. And, well, okay, so somebody lost their hat. But then the hat rose up, and there was a man's head underneath. And the rider said, "Oh my God, man, do you need help here? I've got an extra pack horse. You can have the loan of him." And the man in the water eyeballed the pack horse, and he said, "No, thank you. I have a much better animal underneath me." So then the next landmark coming up the Cowlitz Trail would have been the home of Joseph and Mary Borst. They lived here from, well, in the 1850s, but they built this beautiful house, which still stands, around 1860. And this block house, which is still alongside the freeway in Centralia, was built in 1855. So if any of you have a chance to go down to Centralia and visit the home, which has tours occasionally, it'd be well worth it. Joseph and Mary Borst, like most of the settlers who got here first, were very accommodating of people coming through. You could get the loan of food, seed, oxen, along with John R. Jackson was that way, and of course George Washington and George Bush. If they saw a pioneer in need, they would help you out. And that's why they're so well thought of and still survive in history. Leaving Centralia, you would have come north and eventually hit Mima Mounds. Some people say Mima, I say Mima. But this was an area that was remarked on by nearly every traveler that came through here. Paul Kane, the artist who we just talked about, he came up here in 1847 and said, "This prairie is remarkable for having innumerable round elevations, touching each other like so many hemispheres of 10 or 12 yards in circumference and 4 or 5 feet in height. I dug one of them open but found nothing in it but loose stones, although I went 4 or 5 feet down." Edward J. Allen came through in 1852 and he wrote, "All next day we were traveling over beautiful plains, all upheaved in little mounds about 5 feet high. What was the origin of these mounds I know not. They are too high to be raised by the gophers or by any other animal I know of. The Chehalis River runs not far off, and maybe in remote time has inundated this prairie and in its whirlings worked out these hillocks," which was not a bad guess because I think the prevailing theory today is that the glaciers and the glacier meltwater helped work out these hillocks. And there may be some freezing and thawing involved and somebody shaking her head. Okay, we'll talk about that after. There are also, were they Indian burial mounds? Were they gopher mounds? Were they fish nests, believe it or not? There's been a lot of theories floated. So if you are southwest of Tenino today, and it's this time of the year when the grass is not grown up, you could possibly see these ruts. So these are actually ruts left by people who traveled the Cowlitz Trail. They're really not visible much in the summer and fall when the grass is higher. Do you know where the alpaca farm is? What used to be the Agnew horse ranch? Yeah. If you know where that is and go out there, and fairly close to the main gate of that ranch that now raises alpaca, you can see this lone fir tree out there on the prairie, and you can vaguely see at the right time of the year some ruts that are going off there in the distance. They go right underneath the tree, which obviously means the tree wasn't there when the ruts were actively traveled. But that's kind of a landmark to see those. One of the very, very few places you can see any trace of the Cowlitz Trail. Unlike the Oregon Trail, where there are miles and miles and miles, in Oregon and east of there, where you can see ruts because they're on farmland, they're not built up, they don't have a lot of rain, things don't get plowed up. Whereas here, you either get covered up with houses or moss, one way or the other. So very few leavings left of the Cowlitz Trail. You would have eventually come to a bit of a bend in the trail, which is today's Tenino. And this, of course, this marker didn't arrive until 1906, but this marks where Ezra Meeker placed his first official Oregon Trail marker when he was in 1906, retracing the Oregon Trail and trying to get people to recognize it as a national resource, a national landmark. And then eventually, of course, we come to Puget Sound. And Michael T. Simmons and his wife Elizabeth and their party and other people obviously saw the Deschutes River and the falls here as a wonderful resource for power. So they had grist mills, sawmills, they had a tannery, they had other industries here, wooden pipe factory, all sorts of things that were powered by the waterfalls here. Okay, so where were we? So we were talking about signage in Tumwater at Olympia. So many places here that talk about the legacy of the pioneers that came this far, that actually made it this far. And when you leave, if you haven't seen them already, we've got a little table back there with some artifacts on it, and also over to the side, there's a wonderful print of ox train coming out over the Oregon Trail. So to connect this with the Schmidt House, back in 1945, when Tumwater was having its centennial, Peter G. Schmidt, who lived in this house, purchased that painting that you see out in the parlor and donated that to the city of Tumwater. I understand that print hung for many years in the city hall, and it now lives over the Henderson House, but we were lucky enough to borrow it for today. So please look at that on your way out. On the little table out here in the parlor, there's also a photograph from 1945 showing Peter G. Schmidt physically donating that print to the city, and the mayor at that time was Ray Johnson, is that right? And there's some other artifacts there too. So I don't think that any of the settlers today would recognize Puget Sound. It has changed quite a bit. But it's still here, and they probably wouldn't recognize the Cowlitz Trail either, but even after all these years, 150, 175 years, the Cowlitz Trail is still a transportation corridor. It's still where I-5 is today. So if you think of the Cowlitz Trail starting probably as a deer path, an animal trail, and the Native Americans would have picked it up and broadened it out a little bit to make it into a route where they could travel between tribes to trade food, trade materials like obsidian and those kinds of things, to go to different hunting grounds, to go to fishing grounds, all that kind of travel. The Hudson's Bay Company and other fur traders would have used it, broadened it out a little bit more for horses. Eventually, then American settlers would have come out, broadened it out even more to become viable for wagons. And then finally, when cars came along, things became the Pacific Highway and now I-5. So who knows where the future is going to take us. But I'll read you one more little clip from Edward J. Allen. He wrote in the fall of 1852, when he got up here, he wrote a letter to his folks back in Pittsburgh, and he said, "You will see from the heading of this letter that I have progressed 150 miles further through the bowels of the land, which journey, when is taken into consideration the season in which it was undertaken, the length of time consumed, and the exposure and hardship involved, may very properly be considered an extension of the Oregon Trail." Thank you. And I have got time for Q&A if anybody has anything to ask, and I'll see if I can come up with an answer. Yeah.
How long did it take them to get from
Portland
area here?
up here, depending on what they were doing. They might have spent a few days on the river if they were coming up by river, and then it might have taken a week or so to walk from the Cowlitz Landing area up here. If they were driving cattle and the cattle kept getting lost, which is what happened to Edward J. Allen, he spent probably 4 weeks, but he took maybe even longer, no, but probably about 4 or 5 weeks. But he took a break to go down to Monticello and attend the Monticello Convention, which helped form Washington Territory. But it depended on the weather. Most pioneers were smart enough to wait until summer to do it, so they didn't have to contend with quite so much of the rainy season and mud and swales and swamps and whatnot. But if you're eager to get up here, as Eddie was, when he came up in November, December, it took him quite a while. Yeah.
What again is the name of the book that Phoebe Goodell Judson?
Oh, okay. Her question is, what's the name of the book that Phoebe Goodell Judson wrote? I can't remember the year that she wrote it, but probably in the, well, I don't know, I won't guess. A Pioneer's Search for an Ideal Home. Anything else? Questions? Yeah.
When did they add the stagecoach? Was that to begin with? Where did it start from? And
Well, the stagecoach, like many things, evolved a lot over time. So probably not until 1854 was there a stagecoach on any part of the Cowlitz Trail. And that ran from Olympia eventually down to Cowlitz Landing. And they had to kind of build their own road in some ways. And then as things evolved, it went on down to the Monticello area and even probably down into Fort Vancouver. But people still used the river for quite a bit of time. Again, depending on what they were carrying. If it was just families, they might have been on the river and then caught the stagecoach as they came up. And then as roads improved, and after the 1855, 56, when there was some very little government money available for building a road alongside the Cowlitz River on the west side, the military road, then the stagecoaches could use that. But that was a pioneer-built effort. And then in the early 1870s, when the railroad came up from the Longview-Kelso area, or actually Kalama, then as there was by that time a stagecoach route that ran from Olympia all the way down to the river, to the Columbia, and as the railroad progressed this way, the stagecoach route shortened up too. So it was either railroad, well it was railroad in the southern half and then stagecoach in the northern half, but it kept on shrinking the stagecoach route because who would want to ride in a stagecoach if you could take a train?
Did HBC, I might have missed this, did HBC develop this trail to get between there and Fort Vancouver and Fort Pasquale?
They used the trail. Certainly it was first developed, if you want to call it that, by the Native Americans, because the tribes would have been carrying on commerce between different tribes from, pick a date, I don't know, hundreds and hundreds of years. So there would have been tribes that would have maybe lived here on Puget Sound and would have gone south to pick up obsidian for arrowheads and other points, and they would have traded smelt or eulachon, as they were called, camas bulbs. So it would have been a trade route for the Native Americans long before any British or any other nationality got here. But certainly HBC would have built up the trail a little bit so they could have had horses on it and would have used it for fur trappers and whatnot. Yeah.
Were there offshoots of the Cowlitz Trail, the actual trail that I-5 follows, like there were on the Oregon Trail? And the reason I ask is because my great-grandfather settled in the Skookumchuck Valley in 1856, and he had communication with some of the Indians, and the story that's gone through my family as long as I can remember is that not only did they inform him in the valley that he settled in, but they had memories of the Skookumchuck River flooding from hill to hill. but there was also the implication that was a trail, part of that trail.
Well,
and there is a railroad line there, so
right.
I don't know.
We'll go back to the frayed rope theory. Is that if you were on the Cowlitz Trail and you decided that you liked that piece of property that was 5 miles off, you would have had your own little trail that went out there. So it was a make your own kind of a thing, but probably not to any extent more than it was serving like one ranch or one farm or two, until as things evolved and there were towns built, and then it might actually become a named road or something. You probably heard of the Willie Keel party, who, Willie, who was the one who died back east and missed coming out here, but he came out here anyway because his father pickled him, so to speak, and brought him out in a wagon. So he's buried out by the Menlo area, out towards South Bend and Raymond. And James Gilchrist Swan, another great pioneer, another book you should read, or actually he's written a couple books. He was out here early on, 1853 through 1856, and he was out in the Pacific County area. And he wrote that, I believe it was, I won't quote a year, 1854, thereabouts, that he met the scouts for the Keel party. They had come out to look for land, and he said that this was the first time that a trail was blazed from the Cowlitz Trail west to his area on the ocean. So there's proof that there, if you want to call that an offshoot of the Cowlitz Trail, sure. It's all semantics.
Where does one get copies of these books that you mentioned?
Well, go to the State Library.
Okay.
Lovely place, if you haven't been there. Or the Tumwater and Olympia Library probably have them too. Some of them have been reprinted, so you can find them online or at your favorite bookstore. Comes the shameless commerce part of this talk. If you want to read a good story about travel on the Oregon Trail, this one is called Our Faces Are Westward. I happen to be co-author on this, And I'm not blowing my own horn. I'm blowing the horn of Edward J. Allen because he wrote this book. Dennis Larson and I just edited it and made it available. But this is a tremendous description of travel over the Oregon Trail in 1852. If you want to read about things on the Cowlitz Trail and around this part of the country, you pick up this one. And again, I'm not blowing my own horn. This one is called A Yankee on Puget Sound. Again, this is a book that was written by Edward J. Allen. Dennis Larson and I just edited it. But Eddie was a tremendous writer. He was funny. He was very observant. He was not against Indians, as so many people were. He had a lot of kind of forward-looking social views. So if you want to pick up these books, they're available online or through WSU Press or other bookstores. But there are a lot of other books around.
Are those also available at the state library?
Yes, they are. Yes, they are. They're both at the State Library, and I think they're both at the Timberland libraries too. But if you just go into the local history section of the library, you'll find some great books. Some that were contemporary to the time period, and some that were more analysis types written long afterwards. So.
I know we have a descendant of Michael T. Simmons in the audience,
Oh.
Janet Haig, who helped me on one of the Tumwater books.
Oh,
Well,
well.
I'm her sister, Kathy. Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, we look alike. But I have a question.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just a question, that curiosity. George Bush, back to George Bush and George Washington.
Yeah.
George Bush came out with Michael T. Simmons.
Yes.
Did George Washington, did they know each other? Was that how the confusion
No.
of the name? 'Cause
No,
I
they didn't
always
know
heard
each other.
George Washington Bush.
Right. I think the confusion about the middle name first came because Joe Minto, was it him or Meek? Don't quote me. Somebody writing about George Bush long after the fact used the middle initial W, and people assumed that stood for Washington. But that's the first time in print that a middle initial appeared with his name. And then ever after that, people go back to that as a source, a primary source, and think, well, it must be true. The ink is dry, it must be true. And that's how that myth carried on, because everyone who talks about George Bush and is researching him will find that old document and say, oh, George W. Bush, well, that was almost in his time frame. They must have known him. They must have known his middle initial. But never in any official document, ad in the newspaper of the day, census or anything, was there any middle name or initial associated with Bush. And George Washington came out 5 years later and lived in Centralia. But you can see the confusion. For us, for in this time frame, an African-American living here named George, an African-American living down in Centralia named George. And the two get confused often. So.
Thank you.
Is the middle school George Bush, or does it have the Washington in it?
They put the Washington in it.
Yeah, okay. Okay, her question, if you didn't hear her, was, does the middle school have the Washington in it? And yes, it does. So, unfortunately so. Okay, anything else? Okay. All right, well, thank you again for coming.
And please stay afterwards, look at some of the photos and some of the artifacts. We do have a speaker who's already with us in this crowd here, and that is Drew Crooks is going to be with us next month. And he'll be talking about the Fort Nisqually and the American settlement of South Puget Sound and the transition from British to American control. And so you'll want to be here for that, which is on a Thursday, March 19th for Drew Crooks. Thank you, and thanks for coming. It's a record crowd, 75 people today.
Great, a lot better than what I had last year. Very good.